our waveform vectorscope. In this case, HDRScope. There are 4 different levels of scope, but basically they just are more or less feature rich. They all work with the AJA boards, the Kona and the Corvids. There's also a special version called Network Video Analyzer that works specifically with the 2110-2022 board. So basically, if you're familiar with a waveform vectorscope, this should all look pretty familiar. The scope itself right now is set up with 4 scopes. You can have between 1 and 6 scopes up at one time. So here I have a picture, a vectorscope, a lumiscope, and then an RGB composite scope. Along the right, I've got my meters, which can be RMS, peak, BBC, or loudness. I've got my ability to freeze and reset my picture and select scan lines. I've got my time codes, closed caption detection, VPID detection, and reference. And then I have the buttons that actually control the whole application. The first and most important one is the one that controls the scopes themselves. So if I click on this button with the 4 squares on it, it brings up the configuration for the scope. And you can see I'm in the 4 configuration. It has the name of those scopes there. I can switch from 1 to 6. And for this demonstration, I'm just going to set it to 2 so it's easier to see. So I've got my picture on my right and my other scope. Picture on my left, my other scope on my right. So the list of kinds of scopes are on the right-hand side here of the dialog box. We have the picture, we have the vectorscope, which then has different targets for 75% and 100%, and basically is looking at your CRCB or your UV, your chrominance pieces. There's also the angle marker and skin tone marker. The scope can be done in color or black and white, and there's a low pass. And of course you can set the intensity depending on how deep in the signal you want to look. The next one's a waveform. This is a luma waveform. If I turn that off, I get a YCRCB waveform for each of my components. I can see them as a parade or as a series, or I can look at them as a single composite scope. This is also where you can set your scale. For SD scales, you've got digital, millivolts, and IRE. If you're doing HDR, then you've got your various nit levels. And there's a way to split the signal to look at just the tops and bottoms of the signal, the highs and lows basically, as opposed to the whole signal at one time. And with any of these scopes, you can zoom in on the scope itself. So you can zoom to a particular size, like 2 times. You can set a custom, or if you're not in the configuration, you can use the mouse wheel to actually scroll up and down the size and move the signal around. And if you click the right hand mouse button, it just goes back to 1-to-1 in the center. The waveform RGB is just like the other waveform, except looking at the RGB components. And again, you can see it as parade or over-under. And also you can see a composite view, which mixes all of the RGBs together. There's a couple of different histograms, a YCRCB histogram, RGB, hue, saturation, and value, a straight luma, and then also what we call our HScope, which is a specialty scope for doing camera matching and LED light matching on set, which allows you to calibrate and emulate various professional cameras to evaluate your lights before you have the cameras on set. We've got a chromaticity, which lets you set your various triangles, 601, 709, 2020, and P3. It shows basically the legal and illegal colors within the signal, and there's a couple of different ways to see that. We've got an IP timing, which is in this case showing the timing between the ref and the input, but normally it would be with one of the IP boards, and it would be showing the timing of the various packets coming in. There's an overall status, which gives us the min-max for our luma, our gamut, our U and V or CRCB, and our max CLL if we're doing HDR, line repetition and broadcast to legal pixels, and then our audio and peak and RMS as well as loudness. The last couple of scopes are all audio based. So you've got an audio vector, which you can look at as a polar or lithogist XY, an audio phase meter, an audio histogram with a bunch of different ways of looking at it depending on what you're searching for, and then a straight audio waveform. Now any of the audio scopes can be selected by choosing the pair here underneath the meters. So that's the configuration. The other major, the next button is the configuration of this whole system. And this is where you can select your video input, your 12G type, your signal format, your color format, and your primaries and transfer characteristics. We do have an auto follow input, which will make this change as your input changes. But if you want to manually set them, you can turn this off and just leave it at one particular setting. In terms of color space, of course, we support all the modes that the Kona does. So we support all the way up to 12-bit RGB 444. We support the wide color gamuts, the 2020, the 709, and the 601, both in SMPTE and full range, as well as SDR, HDR10, and HLG transfer mechanisms. You can also down convert the signal in the board. This all just controls the alternate outputs on the boards. We have full closed caption decoding for OP-47, CC608, and CC708, multiple services. When they're present, they show up actually over here as the CC, what we see. This selector here lets you actually display those closed captions right in the picture, so you can view them and make sure they're in the right place. Audio selection, the audio scale types, so everything from your loudness for EBU and for US to BBC meters, PPM meters, and RMS peak meters. If you have more than one board in the system, you can actually set us to the second, third, or fourth board. So if you're using your first board for creative, you can actually wire it back into another board or into an UTAP. We support a number of different kinds of inputs, but the main ones are the AJA and AJA shared. The AJA shared lets you actually share the AJA board with another creative software. So you could be running Premiere out or Flame out, and then we will just pick that right off the board and bring it back into the scope for analysis. There's also the direct show UVC, which works with the UTAP. And we have a couple of scope direct modes. So let's say you have an AJA board in there and you want to use it just for your Avid or your Adobe. You can also send a secondary signal through their transmitters directly to our scope, so you can have the scope and the main output together. And a preferred scan, just when we can't tell what's coming in, this is what we select. There's also, we can do regioning. You can select 8 or 16 channels, and then you can select the audio channel pair for monitoring. The monitoring pair goes out the Bob monitor on the board, and it also comes out through the PC speaker. We also support NDI. If you have NDI streams coming in, you can look at those here. And if you have the Kona IP, this also lets you configure your 2110 and 2022 signals, or you can use the NMOS to do that. In terms of the picture, aside from just the regular viewing, you can also view just the luma, the RGB components of the picture. You can have a zebra, which will give you lumas that are over a certain percentage, and you can set that percentage here. Similarly, you can have a chroma zebra going. You can show clipping, both high and low, edge differencing, which is good for looking for compression errors, focus assist, especially if you're shooting 4K and have an HD scope. This gives you an idea of how good your focus is and where your focus is. There's a calibrate, and this basically allows you to increase and decrease the brightnesses, contrasts, gamma, warmth of the picture. Flip-flop just lets you change the signal up and down and left and right in case the camera was shot in a different direction. You can show the alpha if there's an alpha channel in your signal. You can also compare your signal to a frame using the opacity, which lets you go back and forth between the two. You can check luma keys, green screen keys, and chroma keys. And you can also get a false color for overall exposure, to get an idea of what your overall exposure is. There's a manual, which is just a PDF manual. The camera lets you capture the display, so you can capture your scopes and pictures. You can also capture raw frames, and they're saved as raw 8, 10, 12-bit frames, and you can load them back up. You can also save presets so that you can send particular groups of scopes in certain ways and save them out and recall them instantly. The frame is actually handy because you can use it to compare frames by freezing the signal. So if I freeze the signal here, I can then go between that frozen signal, and that can be a freeze or a frame, and the live, or I can show it as a dissolve so I can see the pair of them together. So this button is the hex view, and that lets you see the actual hex values of the picture. So currently we're looking at the blanking area, the vertical blank, starting at line 10. And if we click, when the signal comes back, if we click down in this picture, it takes us to that point. So you can see what's going on right at that point. And it has the start pixel and the start line up here. You can see it in hex or in decimal. You can freeze it, and you can search for like ANC data, that sort of thing. And if you have a separate ANC, you can show just the ANC data, and it will show you just the CC and the SMPTE stuff. This whole system can be controlled by the web as well. So the next button is the web button. So basically from a web page anywhere in your facility, you can go and you can actually configure how you want your waveform and histogram set up. And look at your event log and do basic setup and viewing. So the next button lets you select an area to focus on. So you can look at just part of the picture, and the scope will reflect just the section you're actually looking at. The key is for your licensing. It just brings up what you're licensed for, which of our applications. And the I is just the splash screen to let you know the version you're currently running. You can also set custom markers or target points. If you hold down the Shift and do a left click, you can make a mark. If you hold down the Shift and Control, you can actually draw a line. If you do Control Alt, you can do a circle or an and these marks will stay in place until you release them. So that's a good overview of the HDRScope, 4K scope, sdiScope, and network video analyzer. Thanks very much for watching, and have a great day.